In the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, in the fall of 1949, people thought Earl Swanson had finally lost his mind. He'd spent 6 weeks building a massive, ugly pole barn. But he didn't build it for livestock. He built it directly over his family's cabin. The structure was huge. It swallowed the neat, respectable log home whole, leaving 4 feet of dead space on every side. From the road, it looked like a wooden coffin. Neighbors would slow their trucks, shake their heads, and drive on. They'd seen men crack under the pressure of the frontier before. This looked like a special kind of madness, and when the winter of 1949 hit, a winter that would be spoken of for 50 years, that crazy barn would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would prove that the quiet man inside wasn't crazy at all. He was the only one who truly understood the cold. If you want to hear the number that made the valley's best builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet ex-Seabee understand about heat and wind that every expert in Montana had missed for 100 years? If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Earl Swanson wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 42-year-old Navy veteran trying to keep his family from freezing to death. He, his wife Margaret, and their 2 young daughters, Clara and June, had moved to the valley the year before. He'd built them a solid cabin. By frontier standards, it was more than respectable. It had tight-chinked logs, a good stone fireplace, and a new cast-iron stove. It should have been enough. But their first winter in Montana was a brutal lesson in physics. The temperature dropped to 20 below and stayed there for weeks. The wind never stopped. It wasn't a gentle breeze. It was a physical force, a relentless pressure against the walls of their home. Earl burned through 6 cords of wood. He fed the stove every few hours, day and night. Still, the cabin never felt truly warm. His daughters slept in their coats, their faces peeking out from under a mountain of blankets. Margaret spent every evening stuffing rags along the baseboards and window frames, only to find the rags frozen stiff by morning. Frost bloomed on the nailheads inside the walls. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The interior temperature rarely broke 50 degrees. On the worst nights, it hovered in the low 40s. That was their life, a constant shivering battle they were slowly losing. Through that long, cold winter, Earl watched. He was a quiet man, an observer by nature. His time as a Seabee in the Navy's construction battalions had trained him to see problems not as mysteries, but as engineering questions. He'd spent time in the Aleutian Islands building airstrips and bunkers in some of the worst weather on the planet. There, the enemy wasn't just the cold. It was the wind, a constant, horizontal, soul-crushing wind that carried freezing rain and sea spray. And as he watched the Montana wind scour the snow from the fields around his cabin, a thought began to form. Everyone in the valley fought the cold. They added more insulation, built bigger fires, chinked their logs tighter. They were all fighting the wrong enemy. The cold, he realized, was passive. It was the wind that was the active thief. He'd watch it hit the north wall of his cabin, and he could almost feel the heat being pulled out of the logs. Wind doesn't just chill the air, it strips heat directly from surfaces through convection. A 30-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees doesn't just feel colder. It has the heat-sucking power of still air at 40 below. It creates a pressure differential that pulls warm air out through every tiny crack you can't even see. His neighbors were trying to build a better coat. Earl realized he needed to build a windbreaker. He remembered the double-walled structures they'd experimented with in the Aleutians. A simple outer shell that took the full force of the weather, creating a pocket of calm, still air around the primary, insulated structure. The principle was sound. Still air is a fantastic insulator. Moving air is a relentless engine of heat loss. His plan formed. It was simple, and to anyone else, it would look insane. He wasn't going to touch his cabin. He was going to put another building around it. He was going to give his house a house. He just had to wait for the spring thaw. When the ground softened, he got to work. The first step was sourcing the materials. Earl was a working man. There was no money for expensive lumber or fancy designs. His solution, like his plan, was ruthlessly practical. He'd heard about a military surplus auction over in Missoula. Decommissioned bases were selling off old equipment for pennies on the dollar. Earl drove his flatbed truck over the pass and came back with the ribbed steel arches of a 24 by 48-foot Quonset hut. The cost, $75. For the walls, he went to the local sawmill, run by a man named Calvin Dreeker. Dreeker was the valley's undisputed authority on building. He'd built half the homes in the county. Earl didn't buy prime lumber. He spent a morning picking through the coal pile, the warped, knotted, discolored boards that weren't good enough for proper construction. He paid $20 for a stack of rough-sawn pine and fir that most builders would have used for firewood. A few dollars more bought him a coffee can full of mismatched nails and a roll of tar paper. His construction process was methodical. He started by digging post holes with a manual auger, a full 5 feet deep to get below the frost line. Into these holes he set thick lodgepole pines he'd cut from his own property. These formed the uprights for the barn. He worked alone, using a simple block and tackle to raise the heavy beams. Then came the framing. He built the walls of the great barn around his cabin, leaving a deliberate 4-foot walkway on all sides. This wasn't an accident. This gap was the entire point of the structure. The narrator can explain this. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. That 4-foot space was creating a thermal buffer, an envelope of trapped, still air. Air that isn't moving doesn't conduct heat well. It's the same principle as a modern double-pane window or the down in a winter jacket. The barn's job wasn't to be insulated. Its job was to stop the wind. By killing the wind, Earl turned the air itself into his primary insulation. He sheathed the walls with the cheap, rough-sawn boards laid vertically. He didn't worry about perfect gaps. He covered the outside with the black tar paper, creating a weather-resistant, windproof skin. Then, with the help of a neighbor he paid for a day's labor, he assembled the steel Quonset arches on top, creating a high, curved roof that would shed snow easily. He covered the arches with more rough lumber and sheets of salvaged tin. Every few hours of technical work was broken by a human moment. Margaret would bring him coffee, her face a mask of worried support. "Earl," she said one afternoon, her voice tight, "the neighbors are starting to talk. Mrs. Colby asked me if we were planning on keeping pigs in the house." Earl just took a sip of coffee and looked at his work. "Let them talk," he said, not unkindly. "It'll work." But he wasn't just building a box. He understood a critical secondary problem. Moisture. Trapping air is one thing, but trapping moisture would be a disaster. It would lead to rot, mold, and sickness. His solution was subtle. Near the bottom of the barn walls, hidden under the eaves, he cut a series of baffled vents about 4 inches high, running the length of the structure. At the absolute peak of the curved roof, he installed a long ridge vent. This created a slow, passive ventilation system. The physics are simple. As the sun hit the roof, or as minuscule amounts of heat escaped the inner cabin, the air inside the buffer zone would warm slightly. Warm air rises. It would drift up and exit through the ridge vent, slowly drawing in fresh, cold, dry air through the lower soffit vents. It was like a house breathing. A slow, steady, almost imperceptible air exchange that would carry away any moisture from cooking, breathing, or the wood stove, but so slow it would never create a draft. It was the opposite of the wind-driven gale that had been battering his cabin all winter. By late September, it was finished. The final structure was jarring to look at. A handsome, well-proportioned log cabin was now completely hidden inside a giant, windowless, tar paper and tin shed. A single, wide barn door provided entry into the buffer zone, and from there you would walk to the original cabin's front door. He'd even built a covered woodshed and a small workshop in the cavernous space between the two buildings. From the outside, it looked like a barn had eaten a house. Total cost, under $150. The $75 hut, about $40 in lumber and hardware, and a few days of his own labor. That evening, Margaret stood with him by the road, looking at their new, strange home. The setting sun cast a long shadow from the monolithic structure. "Earl," she said softly, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Earl put his arm around her. "Maybe," he said, "but this winter our girls will be warm." And when the neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw fear. They saw eccentricity. The ridicule started before the first snow. The mockery began not with cruelty, but with professional concern. Calvin Drecker, the sawmill owner, pulled his truck into the yard one afternoon in early October. He was a thick-set man whose hands were maps of hard work. He'd built more structures in the valley than anyone. His reputation was on the line with every log he sold. He walked around the barn, kicking at the foundation posts and squinting at the roofline. Earl came out to meet him. "Earl," Drecker began, getting straight to the point, "I need to understand what you're doing here." "Trying something different, Calvin," Earl said, his voice level. "Different?" Drecker shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Son, you've built a trap. All the moisture from your cook stove, from breathing, from the firewood, it's all going to get caught in this dead air space. You're going to have condensation running down the inside of these walls like a river. Your cabin logs will be soaking wet by Christmas. By February, you'll have black mold and rot you wouldn't believe. You're building a mushroom farm, not a shelter." It was a reasonable technical objection based on decades of experience. To Drecker, ventilation meant airflow, and Earl had deliberately eliminated it. Earl just nodded. "I've allowed for moisture control." "Allowed for it?" Drecker scoffed. "You can't allow for physics. You've sealed yourself in. This is a mistake, a $150 mistake that's going to rot out a $2,000 cabin." Earl didn't argue. He didn't explain the subtle genius of his passive ventilation system. He knew it would sound like nonsense. "We'll see, Calvin," was all he said. Drecker left, shaking his head, and the story of his visit spread through the valley like fire in dry grass. The professional verdict was in. Earl Swanson's project wasn't just ugly, it was structurally unsound. The public ridicule followed soon after. At the Mercantile, where ranchers gathered for coffee on Saturday mornings, the talk was less technical and more cruel. Hank Gable, a rancher with a booming voice and a mean streak, held court by the potbelly stove. "Heard Earl Swanson so scared of the wind he built a coffin for his house," Hank bellowed, to a round of laughter. The name stuck. To many, it was now Swanson's coffin. The gossip became a constant, low-level hum. Trucks would slow down on the road past their property, the occupants pointing and staring. At church, conversations would go quiet when Margaret walked by. She felt the weight of the community's judgment most acutely. At her quilting circle, a woman patted her hand and said, with saccharine pity, "Don't you worry, dear. Men get strange ideas after the war. He'll come to his senses and tear it down in the spring." Then came the institutional concern. Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent, paid an official visit. He was a man who lived by government pamphlets and agricultural bulletins. He carried a clipboard and had an air of nervous authority. "Mr. Swanson," he began, looking at the strange building as if it were a diseased crop, "I've had some reports. This structure, it's not in any manual I've ever seen. It violates several principles of proper homestead construction. I have serious concerns about airflow, fire safety, snow load." Earl listened patiently. He offered no defense. He simply said, "It'll hold." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Margaret's brother, Thomas, drove up from Bozeman for a visit. He was a practical man, a hardware store owner who believed in doing things the right way. He took Earl aside after dinner. "Earl, I'm saying this because I care about Margaret and the girls," Thomas said, his voice earnest. "People are talking. They don't just think this is eccentric. They think you've lost your nerve, that the war did something to you. They think you're scared, incompetent, maybe both. They see you hiding from the world in there." That was the core of it. They didn't see an engineer solving a problem. They saw a coward hiding from the wind. Earl's face remained a calm mask. He looked at Thomas, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Tom," he said. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." By November, as the first hard frosts settled in the valley, not one person thought Earl Swanson had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own foolishness, a giant, ugly testament to a man who had broken from common sense. The valley settled in for the winter, confident in their judgment, ready to watch him fail. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Earl Swanson right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1949 is still recorded in Montana's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It didn't arrive gently. It descended like a hammer blow. December 8th, the overnight temperature hit minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. December 12th, it fell to minus 31. December 18th, the bottom fell out. Minus 38 degrees with a wind that howled out of the north at 50 miles per hour. Wind chills plunged to 60, 70, even 80 below zero. The snow came with it, not a gentle powder, but a blinding horizontal blizzard that buried fences and blocked roads. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in the valley never once climbed above zero. It was a relentless, sustained assault. The old-timers said it was the worst they'd seen since the legendary winter of 1886. This was the kind of cold that breaks things. It breaks pipes, it breaks machinery, and it breaks people. The valley began to suffer. The suffering was measured in cords of wood and degrees on the thermometer. The Colby Ranch, with its large, well-built main house, was burning 2 cords of wood a month and struggling to keep the inside temperature at 42 degrees. Their cattle began to die in the fields, frozen solid where they stood. The Miller family, a young couple with a new baby, had a small, exposed cabin on a high ridge. They were burning half a cord a week just to stay above freezing. Their chimney, battered by the wind, became choked with creosote and ice. One night, it blocked completely, filling their small home with smoke. They spent the rest of the night huddled in one room, burning chairs and a kitchen table to keep from freezing. Even Calvin Dreeker, the man who knew more about building than anyone, was fighting a losing battle. His own home, built with the best seasoned fir from his own mill, couldn't hold a temperature above 50. He was getting up twice a night to feed his furnace, his massive wood pile shrinking at an alarming rate. Across the valley, the story was the same. Families were living in one room, huddled around their stoves. Children were getting sick. The damp, penetrating cold led to pneumonia and bronchitis. The daily routine became a desperate cycle of chopping wood, feeding the fire, and shivering. And then people started noticing the Swanson place. At first, it was just small things. A passing neighbor, fighting his way through a whiteout to check on his livestock, noticed that the smoke coming from Earl's chimney wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a roaring fire. It was a thin, lazy wisp, almost as if he were burning a small fire on a mild autumn day. Another neighbor, whose own windows were sealed with an inch of interior frost, saw the warm yellow light of a lamp in the Swansons' cabin. Not just for a few hours in the evening, but steadily, calmly, night after night. The most jarring report came from a ranch hand who had to cut across Earl's property to get to a stranded herd. He passed by the great barn in the teeth of the blizzard. Through a small, ice-free window he'd cut into the barn wall, he saw an impossible sight. He saw Earl Swanson walk out of his cabin door into the space inside the barn. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt. No coat, no hat. He walked calmly over to a large wood pile, stacked neatly and bone-dry inside the structure, picked up an armful of logs, and carried them back to his house. He moved like a man doing chores on a cool day in October, while outside, the world was freezing to death. The ranch hand told the story at the Mercantile, and it was met with disbelief. It had to be a mistake, a trick of the light. No one could be that comfortable in this weather. It simply wasn't possible. Stay with me, because the number that came out of that cabin didn't just surprise the valley. In the brutal physics of that winter, it was considered impossible. The vindication arrived on the back of a tractor, in the heart of the storm. It was December 23rd. Calvin Dreeker, his face raw from the cold, was making emergency firewood deliveries. He felt a responsibility for the families in the cabins he had helped build. He loaded his tractor-pulled sled with seasoned birch and headed for the Swanson place, expecting to find them in desperate straits. He was sure their foolish structure had failed, that they were freezing, their logs wet and useless. He was bringing wood, but he was also prepared to bring them back to his own house, if he had to. He pulled into the drifted driveway and killed the engine. The silence was absolute, except for the piercing scream of the wind over the barn's metal roof. He climbed down, his legs stiff with cold, and walked to the big barn door. He banged on it with a gloved fist. After a moment, the door slid open. Earl stood there. The wind howled into the opening, but behind Earl, inside the massive structure, the air was eerily still. Drecker was hit by a wall of nothing, not warmth, but the complete and total absence of wind. It was the most profound sensation he'd felt in weeks. "Calvin," Earl said, his voice calm. "Bit of a blow out there." "Earl," Drecker stammered, his words frosting in the air. "I brought you some wood. I was worried." "Appreciate it," Earl said, "but we're holding our own. Come on in." Earl led him through the buffer zone. The ground was cold, but the air was dead calm. Drecker could see the neatly stacked woodpile, a workbench, tools hanging on the wall. It was like a self-contained world, protected from the storm, raging just inches away. They reached the cabin's front door. Earl opened it, and Margaret stood in the doorway, and the warmth hit him. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of a stove pushed to its limit. It was a deep, radiant, comfortable warmth. It hit him like stepping from January into September. For a moment, Drecker was speechless. Then he saw them. Behind Margaret, sitting on a rug on the floor, were Earl's two little girls, Clara and June. They were playing with dolls. They were wearing simple cotton dresses, not coats, not blankets, dresses. The image was so profoundly wrong, so completely out of sync with the reality of the past 3 weeks, that Drecker couldn't process it. Everything all right in here?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We're fine, Calvin," Margaret said, her voice gentle and calm. She wasn't worn down with exhaustion. There were no dark circles under her eyes. "We're managing just fine. Would you like some coffee?" Drecker stepped inside, taking off his frozen gloves. The cabin was bright, dry, and impossibly warm. He looked at the stove. It wasn't glowing red-hot. A small fire ticked away contentedly inside. "How much wood are you burning?" he asked, the question he was almost afraid to ask. "Oh, about 1/4 of a cord a week, maybe a bit less," Earl said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Drecker stared at him. "1/4 of a cord a week? Earl, people are burning that in 2 days, and they're still freezing. The Millers are burning their furniture." His eyes scanned the room, looking for an explanation, and landed on the wall thermometer. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He squinted, wiping frost from his eyebrows to see clearly. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees. Drecker turned and looked out the small cabin window at the raging blizzard. The official temperature at the county seat that morning was -36. With the wind, it was closer to 50 or 60 below. He was standing in a room that was over 100 degrees warmer than the outside air. He pulled his own pocket thermometer from his coat, a reliable instrument he used for his work. He held it up. He waited. The needle settled at the same mark. It wasn't a faulty thermometer. It was real. He walked over to the cabin's north wall, the wall that should have been leaching heat at a catastrophic rate. He pressed his bare hand against the logs. They were warm to the touch, not cold, not even cool. Warm. He finally turned back to Earl, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. The numbers, the brutal data points of survival, clicked into place in his mind. The Colby Ranch, 2.5 cords a month to hold 45 degrees. The Miller's cabin, 3 cords a month to barely survive at 40 degrees. His own house, 2 cords a month to hold 50 degrees. Earl Swanson's cabin, 1 cord a month to live in comfort at 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. Earl wasn't doing a little better. He was operating in a different reality. Calvin Drecker, the man who had built half the valley, who had mocked Earl's creation as a mushroom farm, looked at the 2 little girls playing happily in their dresses. He looked at the calm, small fire in the stove. He looked at Earl. He finally spoke, his voice quiet and heavy, with the weight of a lifetime of assumptions being shattered. "I've been building cabins in this valley for 40 years," he said. "We've been doing it wrong." This wasn't just about fuel efficiency. It was about human dignity. In this small, warm space, life was normal. Children did their schoolwork without shivering. Margaret cooked meals in a simple apron, not a heavy coat. They slept soundly through the night, not waking to a freezing room and a dead fire. Earl's system hadn't just made the cabin warmer. It had turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. Weeks later, when the worst of the storm had passed, County Agent Abernathy returned. He came not with warnings, but with calibrated instruments and a notebook. He spent a full day taking meticulous measurements. He recorded the temperature inside the cabin, inside the buffer zone, and outside. He measured the humidity. He documented Earl's stunningly low wood consumption. He confirmed everything Drecker had seen. This wasn't a fluke. It was data. Earl even showed him the logbook he'd been keeping, a simple ledger with daily entries for high and low temperatures, inside and out, and the number of logs burned. It wasn't luck. It was engineering. Word spread through the valley, not as gossip anymore, but as legend. By the spring thaw, half the county knew that something impossible was happening inside Swanson's coffin. As the snow melted in the spring of 1950, the first convert came calling. It was young Tom Miller, the man whose family had nearly frozen to death on the high ridge. His face was gaunt, but his eyes were filled with a desperate curiosity. "Mr. Swanson," he said, standing by the now famous barn, "Calvin Drecker told me what you did. We can't go through another winter like that. Can you show me?" Earl didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply nodded and spent the next week helping Miller design a simplified version for his exposed cabin. They couldn't afford a full enclosure, so they built a massive 3-sided windbreak barn that shielded the north and west faces of Miller's home, the directions of the prevailing winter winds. It was a cheaper, faster application of the same core principle. That fall, when the cold returned, the Miller family cut their firewood consumption by more than half. They spent the winter at a steady 55 degrees, a luxury they'd never known. Their success proved the concept was replicable. The idea began to spread organically, driven by necessity. By the summer of 1951, 7 more families had built their own versions of the Swanson Barn, as they came to be known. Some were full enclosures, others were simple three-sided windbreaks. By the following winter, 19 of them dotted the valley, each one a testament to Earl's quiet insight. The institutional validation came from Mr. Abernathy. In 1952, the Montana State Extension Service published his official bulletin. It was titled Windbreak Enclosures for High Plains Homesteads. The bulletin was filled with diagrams, temperature charts, and construction advice. And on the first page, it cited the meticulous data collected from the original prototype structure built by Earl Swanson. The idea spread beyond the Bitterroot. Variations began appearing in the windswept plains of Wyoming and the Dakotas, adapted by farmers and ranchers who understood intimately that the wind was their true enemy. What Earl Swanson had built in 1949, using surplus junk and scrap lumber, anticipated by nearly half a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call a rain screen or a double wall assembly. It's a core principle of high-performance building today. He hadn't invented a new technology. He just correctly applied a fundamental law of physics. Years later, when a reporter from a regional magazine came to interview him about the famous barns, Earl was, as always, a man of few words. He stood by the old structure, now weathered to a silver gray. The reporter asked him how he'd come up with such a revolutionary idea. Earl just shrugged. "It's not new," he said. "The wind is the enemy. It's that simple. This isn't my idea. It's just correct." That barn still stands today, a quiet landmark on a county road. It outlasted its critics and the people who laughed. It stands as a monument not to fear, but to observation, a reminder that the frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sake. It rewarded what worked. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of quiet competence and proven frontier techniques every week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier engineering. The characters and specific events depicted are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the techniques are based on real historical practices and the principles of building science.